So the idea that in order to be completely free, you had to be completely removed from every form of authority that would affect and stop you from deciding as an autonomous person. That's very much a Renaissance view, very much Kantian view. The ability to think independently from religious authorities which are just imposing stuff on you. So I think there's something good in that. And it can be taken in an atheistic, rebellious, destructive direction. There's something in it, something not. But we do recognise that the ability to be free implies to make a free choice implies you've got that moral freedom to do so. And so you end up with that interesting situation there. So Cornelius Van Til was saying the way God is reserving this right to intervene in people. So you can see in a sense, yes, you're getting more of there's a logical case for that. There's a logical imperative to say yes, because you've got that. You can imagine that as a thought experiment. Yes, everybody could have said no to God, and that would have been it. I'll go. Well, what does God do then? It's like what happens to creation because it says that God sustains everything by the very words of his mouth. The whole universe, the whole fabric of the universe is sustained. Colossians talks about that, doesn't it? Talks about the whole realm is sustained by his word. Everything is sustained actively by his word. So you get that sort of like that logical singularity there that it's going to be excluded from the whole of creation. So that is illogical and it's untenable. God must reserve the right to invade the minds and the souls and the hearts of men. But you then had to say, how can you then resolve that problem? That if God's invading, how is God not violating your freedom? And if your freedom is violated, then God's guilty of doing something immoral with regards to his creation. So and so because the idea there is a bit like there's some sort of implicit contradiction between your free will and your freedom as an agent and God's will, that somehow unless you can be completely free in your action, you can't be held like you're morally culpable. And I think that's where the problem is because you've got that logical assumption there, and I don't your will, you can have God can, if you like. There's a nice picture sort of like in one of the Proverbs where it says the heart of the king is the candle of the Lord, and what does that mean? What was the author trying to communicate there? Well, a candle is very, very sensitive to the flow of air. So all it takes is to blow very, very slightly and the candle will move and wobble. And so the idea is that I think what's been communicated here, what I'm trying to communicate and what's being communicated within those there is that God will work through your will but not violate your right to choose and your integrity. So God reserves the right to, if you like, suggest or work through operations of however you want to see it, or movement of the spirit, or through dreams, or whatever it is. God might be the origin of some suggestion to you in your will, and you choose freely to do what the desire of God to do. So, because in the sense God has declared his ownership of the whole of creation in Genesis 1:1, doesn't he? He says, in the beginning was the world, and God created the heavens and the earth. So The reason why that's right in the beginning of Genesis, right the first thing you ever read, is because God then is declaring straight away, the world and everything is mine. The whole universe is mine. And so, in a sense, God is free to do with his things as he pleases. So most, that's foundational in our in interesting political philosophy. That was one of the foundations, wasn't it? In a sense, very strong in the American Constitution. The right to, the free right to worship, it was originally to, in sort of like John Locke's Constitution in the Carolinas, they actually put the freedom to for life and to obtain property, but there was the problem with slavery, and so they changed the word from property to, because people were being considered as property, and so they were very anti-slavery despite the whole argument regarding slavery, and they didn't want to suggest that they were approving of slavery, so they changed it, the right to pursue happiness. And so so God is free to do with his creation what he wants to do with his creation, but he also, to be true to his own character, wants us to act and to freely choose him. That's the story in the sense of salvation. We have a choice because he freely wants to choose us, but he can move through our will, and he can bring things into our consciousness, or he can make us behave in ways which we're not, if you like, consciously aware of why we're doing certain things. I don't know if you've ever had this. I had this experience a lot during a particular phase. It might have been to help me with this issue of trying to resolve these two, because I've mentioned it before, but I am, it's a sort of like day job. I write software, and I often was, when I was dealing with these very complicated technical documents, which I worked somewhere that was where you'd have to deal with what were called ISO documents, the standards documents, and the American equivalents like API documents. And so the engineers, they would build these special rupture disks, and they basically protected sort of equipment and buildings and stop people blowing stuff up. And there's all this very advanced and complicated mathematical equations and that deal with fluid flow and with gas flow and with particular flow, and you'd be trying to unpack this. I'd be working with the engineers, so I was like the technical guy creating this tool for the engineers, because the engineers would use this as part of their job. And I would find myself on this working, and I'd be creating something, and I'd think, why on earth am I doing this way? Surely this is so totally over elaborate for what I'm trying to get to. Then 3 or 4 weeks later, I would find another part of the problem, whereas if I hadn't have done created that the way that I'd created it, when I couldn't understand why I was creating it that way, if I hadn't have done it that way, I would have had to have ripped everything up and done it all again. It would have just been a mess. So consider God was working through my will. I wasn't cognizant of what he was doing, but he was working through me, and he was in the sense conditioning something that was going on around me. And I decided, so it was morally, there's nothing in ethics that would object to that. I'm freely doing something. But behind my will of doing something in a particular way, God was acting. So God can still move. So the idea that when God invades your mind, if you like, if you want to use that, because that's a very aggressive sort of image, isn't it? As if God was invading your mind. But if you think, but somehow God was in the flow of my consciousness, interacting with it in such a way that I wasn't aware of what was happening, but it achieved God's purposes and God's choice. So in a very sort of, what I'm trying to communicate is that the idea of our independence, we might be free, but we're never independent of our Creator. So God can still work through our minds and work through, and He can still, in a sense, He reserves that right to come in. He doesn't violate our moral integrity, our ethical freedoms, but His will, as the owner, He has the right to, for His creation to move to the place where He wants to move to. So there's no fundamental schism between God moving through your free will and that somehow violating your freedom. In more formal, I think in more formal reformed sort of theology, people would say, God works through human free will. He's not, they're not considered as options. A strict Arminian would say that we're complete. The only way our freedom to choose it is maintained, and it maintains, if you like, is when our will is completely independent. It's free and it's independent. But in a sense, the reformed understanding, and the only way I think it's philosophically more sound, is that our will is free, but we're never independent of our Creator. God always has that entrance in. You might then say, and this is something that Paul picks up on, doesn't he? He then says, well, how can anybody oppose his will? And every time I get to Romans, I think it's Romans 9, 10 and 11, isn't it, where it's talking about God's choice, God's election, what's happening with God and Israel, and it's talking about God's choice and God's choosing and God predestining. And so every time I read those chapters, there's always this internal struggle in me, thinking, well, if God has chosen, why am I being asked to choose? And so I think there's always that. You always have to sort of like, when you're getting that sort of utter tension, and as if it's like an apparent contradiction, a paradox, sort of like in scripture, you have to come out, zoom out and look and actually say, yes, God, various times God demands a choice of us. But one of the recurrent undercurrent, one of the principles that you see throughout scripture is that God desires men to be free. Great scripture, John 10:10, the devil comes to kill, to steal and destroy. I have come to bring life and to give life in all its fullness. So it's like God has chosen, and God has a will, and God will choose men and women to do particular tasks, and that's in every realm. That's not just, I'm not just talking about salvation here. I'm talking about distinct in the artistic realm, in the musical realm, in the civil engineering realm, and in all these sort of like different realms of life. God exercises His sovereign choice to ensure that certain things happen in the world, and that we're flowing towards His end, towards a Revelation 23:23 end, which is a great end. We start at Eden, we get back to Eden. And so God is reserving for Himself that the right to intervene in human life in order to get to that end. But one of the greatest values that you see within put in scripture is this importance of the freedom of choice, of ours being free individuals, and us being free. God desires that we should be free, and so that should, I think, offer some sort of mitigation to this great problem of why is there so much evil in the world, because Because from God's, in a sense, if we consider the perspective from God's perspective, what is greater? Is evil greater than good, or is good greater than evil? Now, good's greater than evil. And so in order to promote the greatest good, and to ensure that the greatest good of that aim of right at the end of that we are back in Eden and that humanity is restored and redeemed, and we enter into the next stage. In order for that to be possible, there is the evil in this present age. We, as believers, are responsible for dealing with that evil. So, in a sense, God has already dealt with that evil in the event for us of the crucifixion, and He's given us the authority and the tools, and He says, go out in a sense, it was like a restatement of the at the end where He says, go out into all the world and disciple nations and to teach them to obey. So that disciple, in many ways, that's a restatement of the dominion mandate in very early on in Genesis, where it says, have dominion over the world and everything in it, and order it, sort it, create culture. That the verb, the Hebrew verb, actually is connected with the building of culture. So that was my interest in my master's studies, was dominion theology, of how that's like I believe the best statement of reform principle was the Reconstructionist movement during the 1970s, the sort of what came out of that. There was excesses in the movement, like there is every new movement, there's excesses in it, but that sort of the recovery of a biblical view of politics, a biblical view of art, a biblical view of music, the very Kuyperian idea of the big different spheres of life. And so no matter how, so in a sense, our reaction to evil and to the presence of evil should be an encouragement to us to deal with the problem of evil, because the Lord has given us tools with which to deal with that problem of evil. So you can see, gosh, it's 1 3/4 hours and I've barely scraped the surface of this, but I've tried to try and bring everything together again. So you start off with the problem of free will, which is a philosophical problem. It's like the problem of philosophical determinism is the universe just running on immutable principles of whatever they are, the laws of physics, whatever they are. So people have brought that sort of like idea in, became part of behaviourist psychology in the 20th century, that things are just deterministic. So your moral culpability for actions is not. It's to do with the failure of scientific planners of society to create the proper society. We need to use science to solve those problems. The only thing is, all those concepts of freedom, individuality, have to jettison those because we're now into scientific planning of society, because human beings are basically just sophisticated white rats. So that, if you like, is philosophical determinism. Now, if you take that view of man, then you are adopting a particular metaphysical view of the universe. Inescapably, you're saying there is no God, there's just this determination that we see in nature. We're phenomenalists, we can just look, we can build up data, we can tell what's going to go on in the universe, and therefore we have, if you like, the only reason people have concepts such as freedom, individuality, liberty, all those, more good and bad, they're just hangovers from the Christian understanding of the world, and we need to get rid of those, and we need to embrace the scientific planning of society and allow the experts to create perfect society for us. That is our culture at the moment in the West. That the technocrats, the domination of people talking about wanting to manage misinformation, disinformation, which is basically anything that those in power consider inconvenient is now going to be classified as disinformation. You know, I think it's Jordan Peterson who said, doesn't he? I think I saw him on the thing where he said, who's going to be in charge of deciding that? He said that's the objection and the problem to it, is that if you get politicians defining for you what hate speech is, then who's going to be, so their motivations are going to be, they are going to abuse their power to protect their power, and that is what is happening in the sense of whether it's in the bills that's going on in Australia, I think in some of the US states, I think in California they're doing some sort of bill, you know, they've tried it in Scotland here. I mean, our laws in the sense in the UK on the written law, the statutes are still pretty strong defending free speech, but people have to go to law to get judgments in their favour to maintain their rights. There's the politicians and the councils and businesses and stuff are abusing and trampling all over people's freedom to speak freely and to access other forms of information. They're just calling it, and so it's a real struggle. This is a very practical struggle